Thank you for the songs this morning. We'll be returning to Isaiah chapter 32, continuing our series through the book of Isaiah. This is now message number 39, entitled Behold a King. So we'll be looking at Isaiah chapter 32, and we'll read the first 4 verses to get started. Behold, a king shall reign in righteousness, and princes shall rule in judgment. And a man shall be as an hiding place from the wind, and a covert from the tempest, as rivers of water in a dry place, as the shadow of a great rock in a weary land. And the eyes of them that see shall not be dim, and the ears of them that hear shall hearken. The heart also of the rash shall understand knowledge, and the tongue of the stammerers shall be ready to speak plainly. So chapter 31 that we looked at earlier was a woe pronounced to them that trusted in Egypt. It contained a message of judgment for them as well as for Egypt, that nation. And that trust is seen or shown to be in chapter 31, that trust in Egypt was actually a rejection of the hope of the Messiah. It was a rejection of God's word, of God's counsel. And they wouldn't listen to God's word. They had no patience for his promises. In other words, these were things that they had heard over and over and over again throughout their generations, and they were just tired of it. They didn't want to hear that anymore. And even telling the prophet, don't speak these things to us anymore. But God revealed there that God would strike down Egypt and those that trusted in Egypt as well. And he contrasted the strength of the Egyptians there with God's strength. In other words, if they would think about it, how could the Egyptians succeed in opposing God? And chapter 31 also speaks of deliverance for Jerusalem. But the prophet emphasizes and makes very plain and obvious that will not come from Egypt. And in fact, it will not come from human armies. It's not going to come by gathering up nations and all of these sort of things. It's going to come from God alone and the reign of the Messiah from Jerusalem. So now as we come to chapter 32, Isaiah is actually continuing thoughts about this millennial kingdom and many blessings of that future reign that are to come. And so he speaks of that glorious reign and the blessed conditions of that. He rebukes the carelessness of the people who were careless to this message, heedless of this message, and weary of the promises, in fact. And he also speaks of the outpouring of the Spirit in that day, in the day of his particular kingdom. So we're going to look at this chapter in 3 parts. Verses 1 to 8, where Isaiah speaks of how the king is coming. Verses 9 to 14, that today, or the time then present to them, is no time for carelessness. And verses 15 to 20, where he speaks about the Spirit and the kingdom. So we'll begin in the first part here with the declaration that the king is coming. I'm looking here at verse 1. Behold, a king shall reign in righteousness, and princes shall rule in judgment, or justice. And this word is continuing from the end of the previous chapter. And again, there were no chapters and verses in the original as it was written. And so sometimes where to separate these things is not always easy. And sometimes I think probably wasn't done in the best way. But nevertheless, chapters and verses are helpful to us for study and for reference and that sort of thing. But the king that is presented, this coming king, this one that's going to descend upon Zion, is contrasted from the corrupt leaders that have been mentioned. In fact, we go back to the beginning of Isaiah and we start looking at what was the word, what was the message that Isaiah had for Judah and for Israel before Israel was taken away. And one of those messages was about the corruption of their leaders and judgment coming because of that corruption. And so, one of the answers that was spoken very early on to those corrupt leaders was the coming of the Messiah, as announced in chapter number 9, verses 6 to 7, that Prince of Peace, and so on. And a king is going to reign in righteousness, and princes are going to rule in judgment or in justice. It's not entirely certain, but it could be that this is a reference, the princes is a reference to the apostles that are mentioned. You know that Jesus, speaking to the apostles in Matthew chapter 19 and verse 28, Jesus said unto them, Verily I say unto you, that ye which have followed me in the regeneration, when the Son of Man shall sit in the throne of his glory, ye also shall sit upon 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And so Jesus referred to that promise, and this could be a deliberate reference to that, or maybe it's not being that specific. But nevertheless, the point that's being made is that there is a day coming when there will be a righteous and a just rule that will be coming from Zion, from Jerusalem, and extending over the earth and all nations. Verse 2, And a man shall be as an hiding place from the wind, and a covert from the tempest, as rivers of water in a dry place, as the shadow of a great rock in a weary land. Now, here Isaiah is beginning to describe some of the blessings, some of the conditions of this kingdom when the king comes. So that the nature of this reign is going to be such that protection and provision is going to be provided the people rather than oppression and affliction. Because when there is unrighteous rule, when there is ungodly rule and ungodly authority, well, of course, it's the people subjected to that rule that suffers first and foremost. They're oppressed and they are afflicted and they are extorted and all sorts of things that are done to them. So this righteous rule is providing that contrast. In that day, people and he uses various imagery like shelter from a wind and storm. That there will be shelter, there will be refuge, there will be water in a dry place rather than the desolation. There will be shade from the sun rather than being wearied and hurt by that. So this is the contrast that is being set up, this difference that's going to exist. And of course, the people of Israel, the people of the southern kingdom of Judah, they'd never known. Even if you look at the best of the kings that they had, they've never known this type of reign and authority. And the truth is, neither have any of the nations in the world known this type of reign and authority that's in complete righteousness and justice. We have not known that sort of authority and that sort of rule. And one of the things that a passage like this also shows us is that the problem is not in and of itself authority or rule. That's not the problem. The problem is rather the lack of righteousness in authority and rule. The lack of justice, the lack of morality, the lack of rightness, the lack of a rule that actually seeks to provide for the people and protect. So again, our problem is not the fact and the office of leaders and rulers. The problem is with those who have occupied those throughout history and still yet today. And there's only one king that will reign in righteousness and justice, and that's what's being described in this chapter. Verse 3, And the eyes of them that see shall not be dim, and the ears of them that hear shall hearken. And we could add verse 4, The heart also of the rash shall understand knowledge, and the tongue of the stammerer shall be ready to speak plainly. So we've already seen a number of times in Isaiah where he has referred to spiritual blindness, spiritual deafness, spiritual lack of wisdom. And so this blindness and this deafness that resulted from their unbelief, their refusal to hear God's word, we're seeing a description, and just as we've already seen, there's a time when this is going to be lifted. There's a time when this is going to be changed. Now, we don't want to make the mistake of thinking that this is purely spiritual in application and meaning, but you're also told that the Son of Righteousness is going to arise with healing in his wings. And when Jesus was going about in and around Jerusalem and in Galilee and these various places during his ministry, and he's doing these healings and all these signs and things that he was working, these were just a foretaste. These were just a preview of what those kingdom conditions will be like. So there is a legitimate physical healing that will come about in his kingdom, as well as a spiritual blindness and spiritual deafness and dullness and these things being reversed. So those that shall understand knowledge in contrast. In other words, the people that have formerly been depicted, one of the common imageries that we've encountered lately in Isaiah was that of drunkards, stammering and staggering around, obviously not able to think clearly, not able to perceive and comprehend. And those that have been dull in speech and such will be ready to speak plainly and will in fact speak plainly. It's a time that is described as when everyone will know the Lord and will speak of him. We also get we start to see some effects, some of the results, looking at verse number, well, let's just look at verses number 5 through 8. The vile person shall be no more called liberal, nor the curl shall be said to be bountiful. For the vile person will speak villainy, and his heart will work iniquity to practice hypocrisy and to utter error against the Lord, to make empty the soul of the hungry, and he will cause the drink of the thirsty to fail. The instruments also of the curl are evil. He deviseth wicked devices to destroy the poor with lying words, even when the needy speaketh right. But the liberal deviseth liberal things, and by liberal things shall he stand. So we're getting this effect of this righteous rule and clear sight and clear speaking. Now, liberal is used in this passage not in the way that we typically would use liberal today. I mean, liberal would be negative in the way that we would use it today. But what he's talking about is there's a willing generosity. There's a liberality. In other words, it's not an authority or rulers that are most concerned about enriching themselves off of the backs of the people that they have rule over. But there's going to be a willing generosity, a liberality. The vile person, the curl that are described here, these are essentially seen as the wicked and the stingy. In other words, the point is that they're not going to come to power. That's not what is going to be seen. Hypocrisy is not going to be adored. In other words, these things shall be seen as they are and for what they are. The vile person, the word that's translated here, vile person, is actually the word Nabal. And it is in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew terms that are used, it is the strongest and what we might say the worst term for a fool in the Old Testament. So when you study the book of Proverbs, you find that wisdom and folly are well presented in that book, and that several different terms are used for each. And when you look at those terms and you sort of look at some of the differences and different shades of meaning that they have, you realize that the words that are used actually exist over a range. So there's a range of extremes in wisdom, just as there is in folly. And so this word for fool that's used in the Old Testament, that's used here, is a word that refers to someone who stubbornly and knowingly rejects right. So it's different than the kind of a fool that sometimes is described as being simple in Proverbs. In other words, just lack experience, lack knowledge, just don't have any idea, or the ignorant that have just never been taught or shown a right or better way, whatever the case may be. No, this is one that in full knowledge rejects wisdom, rejects right, rejects truth. And the curl that's being described, that word is as a curl, um, maybe something like we might think of as a scoundrel. I'm not sure what would be the best word to try to describe, but it's a person that seeks to undermine. In other words, it's the sort of person with very ill intent that is working not openly, not with sort of open frontal attacks or what, but more behind the scenes, using gossip and slander and misinformation, always looking for some advantage to press, but again, not up front and center, but trying to profit from doing it behind the scenes. Well, this sort of person, we're being told, is not going to succeed. They're not going to prosper. They're not going to come to power and rule when the king reigns in righteousness. And so, again, the word for liberal has the idea of generous, but also the idea of noble, of being good, and a picture of sincerity, we might say. And so it's describing the righteousness of that kingdom. And this is, one of the instances where it's good to be liberal in that kingdom in the way that this is used. Now we get to verses 9 to 14, and we get a little bit of a change in this message, because there's a warning here. So all of these wonderful things have been described, wonderful conditions, and things that we could only just imagine as being true. None of us have ever experienced this sort of authority and this sort of rule and reign and this sort of peace on the earth. We've never experienced that. And so this warning comes in almost like a wake-up call that says this is no time for carelessness. No time for carelessness. Look at verse 9. Rise up, ye women that are at ease. Hear my voice, ye careless daughters. Give ear unto my speech. So the carelessness and the carelessness of the people more in general is depicted particularly through these women of Judah. Now, we saw something similar to this all the way back in chapter 3 in Isaiah. And here they are being described as being careless, carefree, as being at ease and living essentially in luxury and finery. And really the truth is they're in desperate straits. We are probably, when this prophecy was given, we're within a year of Jerusalem being surrounded and Judah experiencing the Assyrian invasion, which, while Jerusalem did not fall, that is true, nevertheless, many of the towns and cities of Judah did, and Jerusalem was certainly put to dire straits by the invasion that came upon them. So even though the situation is desperate enough that they're going to send ambassadors to Egypt and try to form an alliance with them, even though conditions are desperate, you still have those in Judah, particularly represented by these women of Judah, that were living carelessly, pursuing pleasure, pursuing comfort, and pursuing leisure. Now, once again, just as we saw back earlier, these women that are being referred to here most likely would be the wives, maybe the daughters, the family of those that were leaders in Jerusalem. And in other words, they enjoyed a lifestyle that was higher, that was above. It was quite removed from the experience of the common citizen. And so even though they're in such a desperate condition, they're simply going about with their lifestyle and everything that they've been accustomed to carelessly. Verse number 10 now. Many days and years shall ye be troubled, ye careless women, for the vintage shall fail, the gathering shall not come. Clearly, living the way that they were shows that they did not understand the scope of the judgments that were coming upon them, or else they would mourn. Their prosperity and their ease was going to be greatly upset in about a year's time. But they were complacent. No idea just how close that their misery was. Verse 11 says, "Tremble, ye women that are at ease. Be troubled, ye careless ones. Strip you and make you bare, and gird sackcloth upon your loins." Now, again, back in chapter 3, these women of Jerusalem had been previously rebuked for wearing their fine things for fine occasions when they ought to have been in sackcloth and mourning over the message of God through the prophet. And so the command that's issued here is a command that they need to take off this luxury party wear and things that they were accustomed to and all their finery, and they need to put on those garments that are appropriate to mourning and lamentation, like the sackcloth, like the ashes, because this is what is coming upon them. It says in verse 12, "They shall lament for the teats, for the pleasant fields, and for the fruitful vine." In other words, the things that their lifestyle was accustomed to will simply not be available in this coming judgment. The fruitfulness of the land, in verse 13, "Upon the land of my people shall come up thorns and briars, yea, upon all the houses of joy in the joyous city." So this lamentation was coming, this fruitfulness of the land that they had enjoyed, even despite their circumstances, it's going to be taken away. Verse 14, "Because the palaces shall be forsaken, the multitude of the cities shall be left. The forts and towers shall be for dens forever. A joy of wild asses and a pasture of flocks." So this is describing the desolation of Jerusalem. And of course, these judgments coming were really only beginning with the Assyrian invasion. There was more to follow. Obviously, the Babylonian invasion, which actually led to the destruction of Jerusalem. And he uses this word that is translated here, forever. And the word that is used, it doesn't necessarily mean everlastingly without end. It's a word that can simply mean a long time of unspecified duration. It's obviously that's the meaning here. The context shows, because this desolation that's described of Jerusalem is not final. There is a future restoration coming. So what is being said is that these judgments will last a long time. And it might feel like forever, but there will be an end. So we've looked at that a number of times here in Isaiah, and even talking about as Daniel speaks about that indignation of the Lord, there's coming a time when it's going to have to be expended, when that indignation against Israel for their breaking of his covenant with them, that's going to come to an end. But we're being told here, as well as what we've already seen in other places, this judgment that comes, it may begin essentially with this Assyrian invasion, but it's going to go on for a long, long time. And there's going to be much mourning and lamentation and weeping and wailing because of it. And in the last part of this chapter that really starts in verse 15, that then begins to speak of the Spirit and the kingdom. In other words, what's going to remedy, what's going to bring an end to this desolation that's being described. So verse 15, "Until the Spirit be poured upon us from on high, and the wilderness be a fruitful field, and the fruitful field be counted for a forest." So obviously that word "until" shows once again that these judgments that are spoken of, though they're going to go on a long, long time, they will go on until the Spirit is poured upon them from on high. So this is referring to the blessings with the coming of Christ, coming of his kingdom, and the outpouring of his Spirit that has been prophesied by Ezekiel chapter 39, Zechariah chapter number 12. And it has two effects that will occur. One of those will be the restoration of the land. So the pouring out, the outpouring of the Spirit will result in a restoration of the land. This is where the waters in the deserts and the blooming in the desert and the abundance and all these things, it's described here as the wilderness being a fruitful field and the fruitful field being counted for a forest and so on. And then the second effect is that the people will be converted who enter into that kingdom. So that outpouring of his Spirit in that future time is referring to that conversion and that restoration of Israel. Verse 16 says, "Then judgment shall dwell in the wilderness, and righteousness remain in the fruitful field." So the wilderness and the fruitful field is one of those ways. It's sort of like poetic expression that's encompassing all of the land. Sort of like from saying from A to Z, from the desert to the field, something of that nature. It's the blessings being poured out, and they're not going to be confined to merely one place or to merely one location, and there will be a prevalence of justice and righteousness that's going to be over all nations. We know that he's going to reign, and he's going to do so with a rod of iron in that kingdom. Verse 17, "And the work of righteousness shall be peace, and the effect of righteousness, quietness and assurance forever." So he's describing the fruit of justice and righteousness, and it's going to be peace and safety. There's going to be a rest from fear or from agitation, and there's going to be confidence and security. And it's again describing the times in this kingdom. And people will then be able to work with production, with fruitfulness, without fear of being oppressed or their work being stolen and things like that. They will be able to work and enjoy the fruit of that labor, which will be abundant in that day. Verse 18, "And my people shall dwell in a peaceable habitation and in sure dwellings and in a quiet resting places." So again, here we see the singular word for nation with the possessive, my people, referring to Israel. They will dwell in peace and safety and in quiet resting places. Now, you recall, this is very similar to the language that God used with his covenant with David back in 2 Samuel chapter number 7, when he promised that they would all of Israel would dwell in peace in the land that had been promised to them. So this really is the hope of Israel. And so for thousands of years, and this is a nation that has dwelt in fear, scattered and removed from the full land of promise. And it's only with the coming of this king that's being described that they're going to dwell safely, that they're going to have rest from their enemies. Verse 19, "When it shall hail coming down on the forest, the city shall be low in a low place." So we are reminded, and we get, again, a little bit of that blend of judgment here, that there is something before the coming of this kingdom. And what's being described here really is a reference to what we refer to as time of tribulation. They will not go into that kingdom until they go through judgment. Remember that God has determined these 70 weeks to make an end of iniquity, to make an end of his indignation. And as we've already seen many times in Isaiah, to purge this nation so that that remnant will be preserved and delivered. And this is determined not only upon Israel, not only upon Jerusalem, but upon all of the earth, as we saw back in chapter 28 and verse number 22. So when we start to pull these things together, we see a very consistent prophetic testimony that this kingdom is a real, tangible, geopolitical reality, and that it doesn't come gradually little by little over time, and it is preceded immediately by a judgment that comes on all nations. And that is a very consistent prophetic testimony to the coming of this kingdom that we read in the Bible. And verse 20 says, "Blessed are ye that sow beside all waters, that send forth thither the feet of the ox and the ass." And so this is a blessed state of those that, speaking again, particularly of that remnant that will be preserved, because that judgment is a purging. But in a purging, all is not destroyed. A purging is order to get the purified metal and to rid it. The beating of the chaff, separating the chaff and the wheat. All these images that have been used in Isaiah, we've already encountered, all speak of the fact that there will be a remnant preserved. Not all will be destroyed. And so this blessing is pronounced upon those who are preserved, those that pass through this time of refining and this time of purging in faith. And their sowing will be abundant and the harvest plenteous. In other words, this is what will come about in this kingdom when the king returns. Now, sometimes we seem to have a difficult time with the spiritual and the physical and trying to figure out maybe how these things go together. It seems like sometimes some even seem to suggest that it has to be one or the other. It's something physical or it's something spiritual. But here we see the blessings of the kingdom in this chapter are clearly both. They're clearly both. The blessings of the kingdom that involve a restoration of Israel and a restoration of that land, and also involve salvation and righteousness. And so the point is that both are clearly the Spirit being poured out, the land being restored, the curse being lifted. We've already seen many descriptions of the blessedness of this time when Christ reigns from Jerusalem. And so there are spiritual realities that accompany that, and there are physical realities that accompany that. And really it's both. It's not one or the other. Now, in that future day, when Christ returns to reign from David's throne in Zion, the world will experience a great reversal, unprecedented blessings. No one alive today, or really since the fall in the garden, knows what it is to live on an earth without the curse. We don't know what that is. We don't know what that's like. We've not experienced that. The curse that brings, and the King James uses the term vanity, and it does so both in Ecclesiastes and in Romans, which I love that continuity because I think it is significant. Some of the newer translations translate futility, which is a good capturing of the meaning of the word, because the vanity of the creation, it is describing that there's a futility and a frustration to this creation because of the curse. But we're talking about a time here that Isaiah is describing that when that's going to be gone. That's going to be gone. Men and women will live and work in peace and safety and fruitful abundance in that kingdom. Now, the outpouring of the Spirit that we see references that promise of the new covenant and Israel's future salvation and restoration in the kingdom. And for all of these wonderful blessings to come, the earth must be cleared and purged. In other words, we're told very plainly that God is not going to simply overlay peace and righteousness on top of cursed corruption. He's not going to do that. He doesn't do that in salvation. He's not going to do that in his kingdom. His work will be new, and it will be sown in righteousness. In other words, his work will be made right from the inside out, or from the ground up, however that you want to think of it. All right, we'll stop here and we will close with a hymn.